Yes, yes, yes.
Do you want your hair to smell like fresh coconut and salty vibes?
A few drops of the Herbal Essences Fiji Magic Serum and your hair feels hydrated, silky smooth and smells like coconut paradise.
Oh my god, that actually smells so good.
It's orgasmic. It's fresh Fiji coconuts and I can literally not stop smelling my own hair.
Coconut, salty beach air, I'm obsessed.
The new Fiji range from Herbal Essences.
Moe! It's all right, lad. Right, you're safe with us. We're not turning back.
Doing that removes his agency and turns Native Hawaiians into passive victims of European colonial history, rather than being active participants in their own history. In this case, the truth isn't just enough, it's better. Wanting to go is far more brave and adventurous than how they portrayed him. The show really is a barrage of twisted kernels of truth like that. I'm not going to spend too much time debunking this piece of historical fiction, since I already did that with Cynical Historian over on his channel, and I'm not entirely sure this show will be getting a second season. They've twisted things so badly that I have no idea how they'll connect it to the actual history. Like, this very much mirrors a Native American Last of the Mohicans or Dancing with Wolves type narrative. Case in point, you won't be prepared to find out who this guy is or how they completely change his introduction to Hawaiian history.
Lost. I'm lost. My crew.
In 1790, the American trader Simon Metcalf came to the Kohala coast on the Big Island to trade aboard his ship the Eleanora. He was insulted by the chief Kameiamoku and had him flogged on the deck. The Eleanora then sailed to Maui, where one of Metcalf's men was killed by Hawaiians stealing his rowboat. So Metcalf sailed to their village of Olovalu, invited the natives out to trade, and when their canoes were in range, he opened up with his cannons, killing over 100 people and injuring who knows how many others. Not a great guy, especially when you know that Olovalu was a pu'uhonua, or city of refuge. If someone broke a kapu, the only way they'd escape death was to make it to a pu'uhonua before they were captured. There, they'd be cleansed and freed from any harm. Imagine if Catholic confession was a physical place you had to reach that would make you safe from punishment, like base and tag. I'm not trying to trivialize these, just explain them in a way that people might understand. Pu'uhonuas were incredibly sacred sites. This would be like killing people in a church. It was a major sacrilege. 2 months later, his son Thomas Metcalf also arrived off the Kohala coast with his ship, the Fair American. Kameiamoku, still mad about being flogged on the Eleanora, boarded the ship to trade and slaughtered Thomas and all of his men save for one, Isaac Davis. He then handed the ship and its sole survivor over to Kamehameha. At the same time, Simon Metcalf arrived in Kealakekua Bay also wanting to trade, but Kamehameha refused to engage with him because he didn't want him to learn about his son and the Fair American. Simon sent John Young ashore to find out what the deal was, and he too was captured and held prisoner. After a few days of waiting, Metcalf abandoned Young and left for China. He never found out what happened to his son, but in a strange coincidence, he died in the same way to the Haida people in the Pacific Northwest 3 years later. Kamehameha offered Isaac Davis and John Young a choice: serve him and be treated as a li'i, or die. They chose to stick around. The Bishop Museum accurately describes the two as kidnapped English sailors, but over time, they were fully integrated into the Hawaiian chiefly class, to the point that both of them are buried at the Royal Mausoleum at Mauna Ala. Despite his service beginning under duress, John Young's gravesite labels him as Kamehameha's friend and companion in arms. Kamehameha had seen firsthand what cannons could do in the aftermath of Captain Cook's death. Now, not only did he have his own ship with cannons, he had 2 white men who knew how to use them. He absolutely cleaned house when Kahekili sent a massive fleet of war canoes to attack the Big Island the next year. After the battle, Kamehameha had a huge new temple built near Kauai in the Kohala district. Construction required a human chain consisting of thousands of people to move the lava rocks from their source 14 miles away. Pu'ukohola Heiau is now part of a national park that consists of 3 different temples, and again, all that remains are the stone platforms. It took almost a year to complete, and when it was, Kamehameha invited his warring cousin Keoa over to discuss peace. When he arrived, he was immediately seized and sacrificed to dedicate the new heiau, ending the war and giving Kamehameha complete control over the island. Some of Keoa's descendants continue to hold a grudge against Kamehameha for that treachery, which creates an interesting dynamic. Native Hawaiians have a lot of the same complicated feelings towards Kamehameha that the Apache do towards Geronimo. Outwardly, he was a hero, but internally, he was kind of a jerk. In March 1792, British Captain George Vancouver arrived in Hawaii, or rather returned. He was actually part of Cook's crew during that last voyage. Vancouver's companion vessel sent 3 men to look for fresh water on the north shore of Oahu, and they were subsequently captured and sacrificed at Pu'uomahukaheao. The site still exists, but it's kind of hidden away on a hill in a residential area. On a clear day, from this spot, you can see the island of Kauai, which is 70 miles away. Vancouver met with Kahekili and then Kaumoali'i, the king of Kauai, but not Kamehameha. He then continued north to pick up where Cook left off in his search for the Northwest Passage. Vancouver returned in February 1793, and this time he went to the Big Island to give Kamehameha a gift of cattle and goats. Anyone who's ever visited the Big Island can tell you that those goats still very much exist. You'll find them wandering all over the place. They're probably the only wildlife you'll see aside from chickens. So many chickens. Goats were also turned loose on Kaho'olawe and proceeded to wreak havoc, but I'll talk more about that in a later installment. Go ahead and stick a pin in that, our first of many. During Vancouver's third and final visit in the winter of 1794, Kamehameha was given more cattle, and this time, Vancouver recommended he place a 10-year kapu on them so they could multiply. The Big Island still has a sizable ranching community as a result. The British were doing this all over the Pacific, dropping farm animals on the various islands they encountered so that future expeditions would find familiar foods and not have to rely on the local cuisine. The Hawaiians brought pigs, chickens, rats, and dogs with them when they originally settled the islands 1,000 years ago. The dogs had long since died out before Europeans arrived, and we can assume that the rats were just accidental hitchhikers. Now, growing up, I was always taught that Hawaiians primarily subsisted on a root vegetable called taro. They would mash it into a paste known as poi, which is certainly an acquired taste. Every tourist who gets to try it is told that taro was their staple crop. It's something that every book I read made sure to mention as well, but that claim falls apart as soon as you think about Hawaii's geography. Taro grows in paddies, like rice. It requires a ton of water, and every island has a wet windward side and a significantly larger, drier leeward side. Taro could only be grown in a few areas. Most other parts of the islands relied on sweet potatoes, breadfruit, coconuts, bananas, or sugarcane. But those aren't as exotic as taro, so taro gets all the glory. It was during this final visit by Vancouver that Kamehameha ceded his islands to Great Britain and was presented with a British flag. A lot of people today insist that Kamehameha only meant to form a defensive alliance or make the islands a protectorate, and that he didn't fully understand what cession meant, which is strangely infantilizing and factually incorrect.
How bizarre! How bizarre! How bizarre!
From Vancouver's own journal of that voyage.
In the forenoon, the King and Queen, accompanied by the High Chiefs, all assembled on board the Discovery for the purpose of formally ceding and surrendering the island of Owaihi to me for His Britannic Majesty. And the whole party declared their consent by saying that they were no longer Tanata no Owaihi, the people of Hawaii, but Tanata no Britanni, the people of Britain. The following inscription on copper was deposited in a very conspicuous place at the royal residence. On the 25th of February 1794, Tama'ama'a, king of Owaihi, in council with the principal chiefs of the island, assembled on board the Discovery in Karakakua Bay, and in the presence of George Vancouver, unanimously ceded the said island of Owaihi to His Britannic Majesty and acknowledged themselves to be subjects of Great Britain.
It's tempting to think that Vancouver was lying, but for years afterward, Kamehameha wrote letters to King George III, lamenting that he couldn't send any warriors to help him in his war against Napoleon, requesting more British flags, and referring to himself as your most devoted servant. This is an original letter from 1810. It was written by an English captain, but dictated and signed by Kamehameha himself, or Tama'ama'a as it was spelled at the time. Shortly after Vancouver left for good, Kahekili died and his kingdom passed to his son Kalani Kupule, who survived the damming of the waters. He had to fight a short war against his uncle Ka'eo to secure his reign, much like Kamehameha did against Kivala'o and Keoa. He won the final battle with the help of 3 western ships off the southern shore of Oahu. Kalani Kupule then killed the captains and attempted to seize the ships, hoping to use them against Kamehameha. Instead, the crews were able to take back control, sailed over to the Big Island, and gave Kamehameha all the weapons and ammo he wanted. In less than a month, Kamehameha conquered Maui and its surrounding islands with 10,000 men and 1,200 war canoes, the largest army and navy the islands had ever seen. Kalani Kapule still controlled Oahu, but in May 1795, Kamehameha invaded that too. The forces of Oahu made their final stand in the Nu'uanu Valley, where Kalani Kapule was defeated and sacrificed. The Battle of Nu'uanu looks like a scene ripped straight out of the movie 300. Hundreds of people were driven off the 1,000-foot cliff to their deaths. You'll notice that there are some women in this painting, which is historically accurate. Women often fought alongside their husbands. Today, the site has been turned into the Pali Lookout, and if you go there, you'll get some pretty stunning views of the windward side of the island. Knowing what happened here makes the sheer drop somewhat more terrifying though. The bodies of those who fell from the cliffs were simply left there, which was common practice at the time. Defeated forces were disgraced and not given proper burials. What made this instance particularly special was that just over a century later, around 800 remains were found while building the old Pali Road, which later became the Pali Highway in 1956. When I was growing up, a similar thing happened while they were building the H3 highway. Burial sites continue to be found all over the place. Ancient Hawaiians didn't have cemeteries as we think of them today. Since mana is stored in the bones, and possessing bones meant possessing that mana, people took great care to make sure that nobody found out where their relatives were buried. Ali'i were almost always buried in a cave protected by kapus. Kahunas were usually buried within their specific heiaus, but could also be placed in caves and other sacred sites. Kanakas, on the other hand, were buried wherever their family members could hide them, usually in sand dunes close to shore so they could decompose into the earth.
Advantage of putting them into sand dunes is that eventually they will rot down so that the bones become part of that sand. So the ocean and the things of land become one and the same within this sand dune. Unlike the ground where you can dig it up and you still have a sense of something being dug there. Sand dunes, you couldn't do that.
Rot is kind of a strange word choice. That wouldn't have been my first pick, but there you go. This is from a different documentary made by Native Hawaiian activists regarding the burial ground issue, which aired on PBS. The point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to ancient battlegrounds and commoner burials, none of these sites were marked and have deliberately faded from memory. The only people who knew where they were didn't tell anyone and have long since passed away. They're not rediscovered until someone puts a shovel in the ground to build a highway, hotel, or house. It's not like they knowingly plan the route through a cemetery. When these remains are found, the state or museum comes out to handle them appropriately, often removing them to be reburied elsewhere. Anyway, after Kamehameha captured Oahu, the only two islands left to be conquered were Kauai and Ni'ihau, which were ruled by Kaumoali'i. In January 1796, Kamehameha sent a fleet of war canoes to capture Kauai, and they were lost in a storm. Or so he says. The people of Kauai claim that the army landed and was defeated on the beach. Either way, he failed. Later that year, he had to return to the Big Island to put down a rebellion by another one of Keoa's brothers, Namakeha from Hilo, who, like all the others, was defeated and sacrificed. Minor revolts continued across the island for several years. In 1802, a 10-year-old boy named Opu Kahaia saw his parents get brutally murdered when Kamehameha's forces were raiding in Ka'u. He attempted to flee with his 3-month-old brother on his back when someone threw a spear, impaling his brother and leaving him wounded. The injured Opu Kahaia was then taken captive, but when it was discovered that his uncle was a kahuna at Hikiau Heiau, he was sent there to be trained as a priest. Keep your eye on that one. Hawaiians often bring up one of Kamehameha's early decrees known as the Law of the Splintered Paddle as a way to portray him as exceptionally kind towards his people. I heard the story multiple times while growing up, so I might as well pass it on to you. Back in 1783, during his initial attempt to conquer the Big Island, Kamehameha was raiding near the coast when he attacked some fishermen and his foot got stuck in a crevice. He was then struck in the head with a paddle, shattering it and knocking him unconscious. I personally think that he made up the foot thing because he didn't want to admit that he was bested by a commoner, but that's just my opinion.
Stop browsing flights and start booking them. Sydney has the harbor to take in, Perth has waves to catch, and New Zealand has epic landscapes to explore. So, if you're going there, So are we.
When he regained consciousness, Kamehameha realized that he was the one in error, pardoned the fishermen, and placed a kapu against all further killing of civilians, a declaration known as Kanavai Mamalahoi, or the Law of the Splintered Paddle. But as you just heard with Opu Kaha'ia, they were still doing it some 20 years later. When an opposing army was defeated in battle, it was pretty common for the soldiers to sack the now defenseless village, killing and taking whatever they wanted. And to be fair, that's how it was done pretty much everywhere until fairly recently. But you don't get to claim that your leader was unusually kind and benevolent towards civilians, while also telling stories about Opu Kaha'ia's parents being indiscriminately slaughtered. Things eventually calmed down, and by 1804, Kamehameha was preparing to take another crack at conquering Kauai. Unfortunately, he and his army came down with cholera, postponing the invasion. He ordered his kahunas to find out who was responsible for the outbreak. 3 men were found to have eaten foods that were under kapu, and they were sacrificed at Waikiki Heiau. Kamehameha spent the next several years trying to convince Kaumo'oli'i to come to Oahu to discuss peace. But everyone remembered what happened to Keoa at Kauai, so, would you do it? Probably not, right? It wasn't until the spring of 1810 that the two finally met up. To ensure that there wouldn't be any trickery, they paddled their own canoes out into the open ocean to face each other one-on-one. At that meeting, Kaumo'oli'i joined the islands of Kauai and Niihau with the rest of Kamehameha's kingdom on the condition that he remain as their king. In other words, he ceded them and became a vassal king under Kamehameha, just as Kamehameha was under his Britannic Majesty, furthering the point that they all understood what a cession was. To this day, the people of Kauai don't like it when you refer to Kamehameha as the Conqueror, because they weren't conquered at all, which is fair. They joined in the same way that Dorne did in Game of Thrones. They even got to keep their own royalty. So finally, Kamehameha had united all the islands into a single kingdom, and since he was originally from the island of Hawaii, the entire thing was called the Kingdom of Hawaii. Interesting to think that if he was from Maui, we'd be talking about the Mauian Islands instead of the Hawaiian ones. Kamehameha then returned to his royal estate in Kona to rule his kingdom in relative peace. The site is now the Courtyard King Kamehameha Kona Beach Resort, and you better believe that's where I stayed during my research trip to the Big Island. They even had a 2/3 scale replica of the heiau that used to be there. Nathan Winship was an American trader who had dealings with both Kamehameha and Kaumo'oli'i, and at Kamehameha's request, he helped broker the peace deal between them. As a thank you for his service, Kamehameha gave Winship a total monopoly on the nascent sandalwood trade, while getting to keep 25% of the profits for himself. Sandalwood became Hawaii's only real export, which was primarily sold to China. Americans would arrive in Hawaii with goods to trade for sandalwood, which they'd take to China to trade for things like silk to bring back to the States. That arrangement lasted until the War of 1812, when the British blockaded all of Winship's American vessels from trading in the islands. Yeah, other things were happening in the world too. Hawaii didn't exist in a vacuum. At least not anymore. This was despite the fact that the British had never acknowledged or acted on Kamehameha's cession offer. They didn't send a governor, consul, garrison, or anything. So technically, in the eyes of Europe, the islands were still up for grabs. Knowing that, in 1816, the Russians started building a fort on Oahu. They were heavily involved in the fur trade in the Pacific Northwest and wanted to use Hawaii as a central trading post. The first foreign country to make a territorial claim on the islands wasn't Britain or America, it was Tsarist Russia. Kamehameha sent his British captive companion John Young to kick the Russians out and break up the fort. He got them to leave, but then he claimed it for Hawaii and renamed it Fort Kekuanohu. It's the reason Fort Street in downtown Honolulu is named Fort Street. It was taken down in 1857, but stood where the Aloha Tower exists today. After leaving Oahu, the Russians agreed to help Kaumo'oli'i overthrow Kamehameha and began constructing Fort Elizabeth near Waimea, where Captain Cook first landed. This one still exists on Kauai as a state park. See this outline of foliage? Those were the earthen walls of the old Star Fort. Kamehameha found out about this and ordered the Russians removed a second time. He presumably didn't learn about Kaumo'oli'i's plans because he kept on living and ruling as Kauai's king. But this event inspired Kamehameha to design his own flag as a way to deter any future claims or invasions. Everyone seems to think that Vancouver gave Kamehameha a Union Jack when he ceded the islands. It's in multiple books, including Unfamiliar Fishes, but it was actually a red ensign, which was the design most colonies used. Still believing that Hawaii was under British rule, Kamehameha took that flag and added blue and white stripes to it, making it look like this. I've seen a dozen different explanations for why he chose this red, white, and blue stripe pattern, and I'm not sure which one, if any, is true. Most versions involve them also wanting to be friendly with the United States and France. In 1845, they flipped the color scheme around and redesigned it with only 8 stripes, one for each island. This is the flag they used for the rest of the kingdom's existence and is still the state flag today. But the important point is, this is the original flag for the Kingdom of Hawaii, not this. This was designed by a sovereignty activist in 2001. Gene Simeona claims that some random guy told him that the current flag was not the original, so he scoured the state archives to uncover this design and began mass producing them to sell at a profit. Despite that obvious lie, it's become a symbol of the native sovereignty movement and is known as the Kanaka Maoli flag. But I can't stress this enough, it has no basis in history. Prior to European contact,
Get more from your holiday with 2E. Get more splash with free on-site water parks and kids pools, and get more bliss with swim-up rooms and foodie-approved dining. You book it, 2E sort it. Click to explore more.
chiefs used feathered staffs known as kahilis. The larger and taller they were, the higher the rank and status of that particular chief. They continued to use them as personal standards well into the kingdom period. A kahili sits at the center of the crest in the Kanaka Maoli flag, along with 2 crossed oars. Despite its apocryphal nature, this is the symbol Civ 7 decided to go with to represent Hawaii in their game. It's totally fine to have a flag for your movement, but you gotta stop pushing the false narrative that it was the original before the British showed up. There were no flags before then. This is the original. Before the Rasta flag was created, sovereignty activists flew, and still fly, this one upside down, showing the kingdom in distress. Yes, it does have colonial imagery. That was the point. Kamehameha was trying to signal that these islands were spoken for. If you're gonna blame anyone for the design, blame him. After all this, Kamehameha's health began to decline, and he refused to allow the kahunas to make human sacrifices to improve his condition, declaring that the people are kapu for the king. On May 8, 1819, Kamehameha died and the kingdom passed to his son Liholiho, who was not his firstborn, but was the highest ranking since his mother was Keopuolani. Kamehameha had 34 other children by 18 of his 30 different wives. Keopuolani was his most sacred wife, given to him after he captured Maui. She was spiritually the highest ranking alii in the kingdom because she was the product of a brother-sister relationship.
A suitable partner for a chief of the highest rank was his own sister, begotten by the same father and mother as himself. And if the union bore fruit, the child would be a chief of the highest rank, so sacred that all who came into his presence must prostrate themselves. He was called divine, Akua. Such an alii would not go abroad by day, but only at night, because if he went abroad in open day, everyone had to fall to the ground in an attitude of worship.
Reminder that this is how they treated Cook too. But Keopuolani was of such a high rank that even Kamehameha had to prostrate himself and strip entirely naked in her presence. She gave him 3 children, all of whom outranked him since they had so much more mana. The eldest was Liholiho, followed by his brother Kauikeaoli and sister Nahi-Enaena. Whenever a king died, people would often mutilate themselves in their grief, and kahunas would sacrifice people in their memory. But this time, Liholiho ordered that nobody be harmed or killed. Unlike previous kings, whose remains were typically put in above-ground caves and mausoleums, Kamehameha's bones were placed underwater in a secret cavern so that nobody could ever find them. When Captain Cook first arrived in 1778, he estimated that there were 300,000 Hawaiians living in the islands. When Kamehameha died, the population had been cut in half. Not only were thousands of people killed in battles and raids, but several times during his conquest, he ordered the mass culling of animals to punish the population. Tens of thousands died from the subsequent famines. It should be noted that aside from that cholera outbreak in 1804, Western diseases were still quite rare in the islands. They were so far away from everything else that if you boarded a ship while infected with smallpox or measles, you would either die or recover by the time you got there. That would eventually change as technology advanced, but at this point in history, Hawaii was still relatively safe. Kamehameha had also become addicted to the wealth generated by his monopoly on the sandalwood trade. He ordered Kanakas to abandon farming and fishing to cut down trees until more famines developed and he reversed course. By the time of his death, he had hoarded $250,000 from it. That's not adjusted for inflation, by the way, that's 1819 money. During Liholiho's ascension ceremony, his father's widow, Ka'ahumanu, made this declaration.
O Liholiho, O chief, I make known to you what your father commanded me. Here are the chiefs and the men of your father. Here are the guns and the land. All the possessions are yours, but you and I shall rule this land together.
Ka'ahumanu was a force to be reckoned with. She weighed around 500 pounds, and as Kamehameha's favorite, she was given a lot of political power during his reign. When he died, she claimed that he wanted her to continue in that position after his death.
She summoned Liholiho and said, "Oh, chief, there are your lands. Those are your chiefs. Here are your guns. But you and I will rule together." And that's not what she meant. She meant I will rule. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of my way.
She was, for all intent and purposes, the sole ruler of the island. Liholiho was the puppet king.
She declared herself to be Kuhina Nui, a position that had never existed before this moment. It was a sort of regent or co-ruler. Liholiho had no real choice but to accept her terms and became Kamehameha II. It was customary after the death of a king for the successor to redistribute lands to the chiefs most loyal to him, which almost always resulted in a war when one chief tried to take more than was allotted. Ka'ahumanu and Liholiho wanted to prevent that from happening. They were quite happy with the current power structure and had no intention of giving it up. Instead, Kamehameha II relinquished the royal monopoly on sandalwood that Kamehameha I established, allowing individual chiefs to enter the trade for themselves, which I'm sure will have no negative consequences later on. That didn't quite satisfy everyone though. Kekua o Kalani, the man named by Kamehameha to take his old position as keeper of the war god.
Parents, why pay to go sightseeing when children see wonder in the mundane? Take them sightseeing. Explore by big old logs. Wow, rotting wood. Bollards. So cool. Marvel at the small square rock.
Why is it so square?
Just make sure that they can see these wonders clearly, because around 1 in 5 young
Still wanted the land to be redistributed. I bet you can guess where this is headed, but probably not how they get there. Ka'ahumanu decided that the only way to secure the kingdom and end the old squabbles was to end the old ways entirely. So when Makahiki approached that year, she hatched a plan. At the first royal feast of the season, Ka'ahumanu told Liholiho,
If you wish to observe Kapu, it is well, and we will not molest you. But as for me and my people, we intend to be free from Kapu. We intend that the husband's food and the wife's food shall be cooked in the same oven, and that they shall be permitted to eat from the same calabash. We intend to eat pork and bananas and coconuts. If you think differently, you are at liberty to do so. But for me and my people, we are resolved to be free. Let us henceforth disregard Kapu.
Let us disregard Kapu, the system that had governed Hawaii for hundreds of years. When she says my people, she's referring to women. Women were not allowed to eat pork, bananas, or coconuts. There were actually dozens of fish, berries, and other foods that were also off limits, and the punishment for eating any of those things was death. But the highest kapu of all was that men and women were not permitted to eat in the same room together, and their food had to be prepared separately. It was known as the ai kapu. As soon as Ka'ahumanu sat down to eat at the royal banquet, Liholiho stood up and bailed. That was a bridge too far for him. So his mother, Keopuolani, the highest ranking person in the islands, brought out her other son, the 6-year-old Kaui Keauli, and they all ate together. That didn't end the system though, that just meant that all of these people were defying gods and needed to be punished. Was Liholiho going to let his mother, brother, Kuhina Nui, and everyone else be put to death? Of course not. So a few weeks later he arranged for another feast, this time with 2 tables, one for the men and one for the women. Here's Ka'ahumanu's account of the event.
After the guests were seated and had begun to eat, the king took 2 or 3 turns round each table as if to see what passed at each. And then suddenly, and without any previous warning to any but those in the secret, seated himself in a vacant chair at the women's table and began to eat voraciously, but was evidently much perturbed. The guests, astonished at this act, clapped their hands and cried out, "Ainoa, the eating kapu is broken!"
The earth didn't shatter, the sea didn't evaporate, and the volcanoes didn't explode. Everything was fine. That historic meal, known as the Ainoa, took place sometime around the end of October or beginning of November. At the end of it, Liholiho ordered that the idols be burned, the heiaus be demolished, and kahunaism be outlawed. The one date that we know for sure is that by November 6, 1819, word had reached Oahu that people could eat freely and Kapu was dead.
So you can imagine if everybody went into all the churches in your neighborhood, broke up the churches, broke up the images, knocked down all the crosses, and said God no longer exists. This is exactly what happened to the Hawaiians.
Words cannot describe how significant this was. In fact, the absence of a certain word makes this event especially unique. Have you noticed that I haven't mentioned missionaries even once? That's because there weren't any. The Hawaiians were the ones who went into the neighborhoods to break up the churches and knock down the images. Not missionaries and not foreigners. All those times I was telling you that the rock platforms for those heiaus still exist, but the buildings have long since been taken down, this is why. It wasn't Westerners or even the passage of time, it was the Hawaiians themselves. I can't stress that enough. As far as we know, this was the first and only time in history where a people abolished their own religion without a replacement. Everyone else abandoned their native religion to convert to something else, usually Christianity, which is what happened to the Tahitians and their taboo system around the same time. The Hawaiians did it of their own accord, apropos of nothing, which right away goes against the idea that they were stripped of their religion by the US government, or even just American Christians. It was their own royalty without any outside influence that abolished Kapu. And if I can be honest for a moment, good. Look, all cultures are valid, but not necessarily all practices. Any system where you could be put to death for stepping on someone's shadow or catching a fish out of season should be abolished. Actually, you didn't even have to do that. You could be sacrificed for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Kapi'olani was one of the women who conspired with Ka'ahumanu and Keopuolani to end Kapu. She was an ali'i nui of the Hilo district, and when she was a child, she ate a banana, which was forbidden. Since she was a highborn, they obviously didn't want to kill her, so her favorite servant, a boy named Mao, was put to death in her place. Yeah, that'll show her for breaking the rules. I'm glad this system is gone. If it existed today, I would support military action to stop it. Which is exactly what the king did. He sent his own troops to put down the religion's final supporters. Kekua o Kalani, keeper of the war god, thought that the royal court had committed the ultimate blasphemy and began a rebellion. Which makes sense, right? Of all people, the defender of the faith would be the one to fight to keep the old system around. That's kind of the whole point of that position. In December 1819, Liholiho dispatched an army under his prime minister Kalani Moku to meet Keokuolani's forces at Kuamo'o. It's said that Ka'ahumanu herself manned a cannon during the battle, and the rebellious forces were easily defeated. Kekua o Kalani was killed by musket fire along with his wife Manono, and they were buried somewhere in the lava rocks here. It's now a historic site and burial ground. The sign out front accurately details what happened here and why, but this place isn't really frequented by tourists. It's kind of out of the way, and there are plenty of other places to go if you want to see a lava field. But it's on this spot that the kingdom was finally united for good. There would never be another significant rebellion, and power was now consolidated within the ali'i caste. The seasonal shift to the kahunas would no longer take place. Remember Opu Kaha'ia? I told you to keep your eye on him. He was training to be a kahuna at Hikiau Heiau in 1808 when he witnessed his aunt being thrown off a cliff for breaking a kapu and decided he had enough. Following Katiana's trip 20 years earlier, it was becoming increasingly common for Hawaiians to willingly join the crews of foreign vessels in search of a better life, or even just some adventure. So at 16 years old, Opu Kaha'ia hitched a ride on the American trading ship Triumph with a fellow Hawaiian named Hopu who was only 9 years old. Aboard the ship, they were given the anglicized names Henry Obukia and Thomas Hopu. The ship took a cargo of sandalwood and went up to the Aleutian Islands to pick up seal skins. Then it sailed to Macau and Canton to trade those goods for silk, tea, and spices, and then made its way to New York, arriving in 1809. Gossip about these two Hawaiians spread quickly in New York, and the boys were invited to the theater and the next day, lunch. This is how Opu Kahaia described it in his journal.
One evening, two gentlemen called on board the ship to see us. We went with them into the playhouse and saw a great number of peoples as I ever saw before. The next morning, the same two gentlemen called again and invited us to come to their house that forenoon. I thought while in the house of these two gentlemen, how strange to see females eat with men.
Since he left before the Ainoa, this would have been the first time he'd seen that. After selling its goods in New York, the Triumph continued to its home port in New Haven, Connecticut. The story goes that Henry Opu Kahaia soon found himself crying on the steps of the Yale Library because nobody would teach him, until a man named Edwin Dwight found him and took him on as a student. Imagine trying that today. According to Edwin's account of events, after very little instruction, Henry had an epiphany and said,
Oahi gods, they would burn. We go home, put them in a fire, burn them up. They no see, no hear, no anything. We make them. Our God, he make us.
He's referring to the Christian God here, who he quickly adopted as his own. 2 years later, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or ABCFM, opened a school with the goal of training heathen youths to become missionaries and convert their own people. Edwin Dwight was selected as the Foreign Mission School's teacher, and Henry and Thomas were in the inaugural class, along with 3 other Hawaiians who had also made their way to New England, including Kaumo'oli'i's son Humehume, who was given the name George Kaumo'oli'i, or George Tamari since nobody could pronounce that. Opu Kahaia was Edwin's personal favorite and showed the most promise until February 17, 1818, when he died of typhus. The 4 other Hawaiians vowed to continue the cause, but the ABCFM had a hard time drumming up support for a mission. So Edwin Dwight compiled Opu Kahaia's journals and letters and published Memoirs of Henry Obukia shortly after his death. This was the first of 2 incredibly important books that dramatically changed the course of Hawaiian history. The next one won't come along until the 3rd episode of this series, but without Henry's memoirs, there would be no missionaries sent to Hawaii. Or at least, not American missionaries. People from all over the US read Henry's plea to Christianize his home country and answered the call, or donated to the cause. For some context, this was during the Second Great Awakening. While William Miller and Joseph Smith were off doing their own things, Protestants who didn't want to found new religions but still wanted to do something became missionaries. Nobody was allowed to join the mission without being married, so men and women quickly paired up with whoever else was willing to go. Kinda reminds me of guys in the military getting ready to deploy. The Sandwich Islands mission was formally organized under Reverend Hiram Bingham with only 23 members, 14 missionaries, 5 children, and 4 Hawaiians. They departed from Boston on the Thaddeus on October 23, 1819, a year and a half after Henry's death, and were given the following instructions.
You are to aim at nothing short of covering those islands with fruitful fields and pleasant dwellings and schools and churches, to obtain an adequate knowledge of the language of the people, to make them acquainted with letters, to give them the Bible with skill to read it, to turn them from their barbarous courses and habits, to convert them from their idolatries and superstitions and vices, to the living and redeeming God.
That all sounds like pretty standard missionary stuff, right? But here's the important bit.
You will withhold yourselves entirely from all interference and intermeddling with the political affairs and party concerns of the nation of people among whom you reside, paying proper respect to the powers that be, and rendering tribute where tribute is due.
They were specifically told not to meddle in the internal affairs of Hawaii, and despite what you may have heard, they didn't, at least not directly. Their Christian influence on the native Hawaiians had an obvious impact, and then eventually their descendants would get a little too involved, but that's a story for later. It's important to remember that these initial missionaries were volunteers sent by a church. They weren't colonizers or settlers sent by any government. The United States had no interest in taking over a bunch of islands on the other side of the world. This was 1819. The newest state was Illinois. The only thing west of the Mississippi was Louisiana, and that barely counts since the river cuts right through it. Florida still belonged to the Spanish, the Indian Removal Act and Trail of Tears hadn't happened yet. The United States was nowhere near being an expansionist empire. Not yet, anyway.
At Vistaprint, we print just about everything possible. Stickers with your logo, branded signage, or even 200 t-shirts with your face on. We're in. With our decades of know-how, we're ready to bring your ideas to life. Vistaprint. Print your possible at vistaprint.co.uk.
The Thaddeus made the journey around Cape Horn and sighted the Big Island on March 30th, 1820, 160 days after they left New England. They sent a boat ashore to ask for permission to land and received this reply.
Kamehameha is dead. Liho Liho is king. The Kapus are abolished. The Heiaus destroyed. The idols burned. The supporters of the old order have been overthrown in battle.
Yeah, all that stuff I told you about the Kapu system being abolished, that was 5 or 6 months before the missionaries arrived. I don't believe in divine providence, but the missionaries sure did.
With news of King Kamehameha's death, that the worship of idolatry and other heathenish customs are entirely abolished. Such glad news we were not prepared to receive. Truly, the Lord hath gone before us in mercy.
When the Pilgrims first landed in New England, they said the people had no religion because they were racists who didn't recognize Native American practices as a religion. But when these missionaries arrived in Hawaii, they legitimately had no religion. The people were still spiritual, they still believed in mana, and the kingdom still had laws that they called kapus, but the gods, temples, priests, and human sacrifices were all gone. Now, before we move on in the story, I need to bring up this one specific quote from Unfamiliar Fishes. I seem to have a section like this in every one of my videos now.
When Kamehameha ceded the islands to George Vancouver, he also granted the Englishmen permission to send missionaries, British missionaries. So when the American missionaries showed up in 1820, Keanusai said the chiefs knew missionaries were coming. The problem they had was that they weren't British. That's why they made them sit there off the coast and said, "You're going to sit there until we find out what we're going to do with you," because that could affect their allegiance to Great Britain. So John Young, an Englishman who was a trusted advisor to the Kamehamehas, was told to go on the ship, find out who they are, why they are here. And then he came back and he said, same religion, different nationality.
This is one of those stories that sounds just a little too cute and quirky to be true. I'm not sure how I knew that, but it just ties together too nicely, you know? And the more I looked into it, the more this paragraph made me realize that this book, my favorite book, was full of shit. There are so many red flags. The first thing I noticed was this. Vancouver's last visit was in 1794. You're telling me that when American missionaries showed up 26 years later, the chiefs were like, "Ah, yes, we were expecting you, but what's with the funny accents?" Come on. Most of the information she's presenting in this paragraph, and most of the book, are actually just quotes from interviews. It didn't come from Cook and Doll page 324 or whatever, it's, here's what Keanusai told me. So the next obvious question is, who is Keanusai? She introduces him as a Hawaiian historian, but upon Googling him, I learned that he's a prominent sovereignty activist with a PhD in political science. He's currently the acting Minister of the Interior and Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Hawaiian Kingdom government, one of the many sovereignty groups claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the Old Kingdom. After learning that, everything he said in the book became suspect, which made me dig into the claim even more. His dissertation is available online. In it, he argues that the Native Hawaiians are not indigenous people taken over by the United States, but rather nationals of an extant and otherwise occupied Hawaiian state. Here's the part where he makes the claim about Kamehameha asking Vancouver to send missionaries.
According to Hopkins, Kamehameha also requested of Vancouver that on his return to England, he would procure religious instructors to be sent to them from the country of which they now considered themselves subjects.
Okay, so I go to the Library of Congress and find Hopkins' book. Here's the quote, just as it appears in the dissertation. Hopkins doesn't have footnotes or citations because this was written in 1862, but just a page or two earlier, he references James Jackson Jarvis, who he describes as a candid and industrious historian, but an American citizen. You'll see why that's important in a moment. Going to Jarvis's book from 1843, we find that
Vancouver told him of the one God, creator, ruler, and judge of all races, whose spirit pervaded the heavens, that their earthly deities were in vain and foolish, their taboo system tyrannical and injudicious, and that if he desired it, he would request the King of England to send him a teacher of the true religion. His instructions seem to have made little impression upon the heart of the king, who, either from conviction or policy, was strongly attached to the idolatry of his country.
This directly refutes Hopkins' claim, and by extension Keanusai's, that Kamehameha requested missionaries. He outright refused them. In fact, when we look at Vancouver's own journal, we get confirmation that he agreed not to interfere with the religion at all.